Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hi, everybody. It's Alfredo, Bill, and myself from VSIG, and it's our pleasure to have Dr. Mark Leiser talk about emergent technology. This is the last module in Group K, and we're looking forward to his session. So I'll turn it over to him. So we're recording now.
Thank you, Glenn. And that is Dr. Mark Leiser. I'm a professor in digital legal and platform regulation. This is an agreed term at my present employer, which I'm going to be leaving actually at the end of this month. So for completion's sake, I'm going to be formally assistant professor of digital legal and platform regulation at the Vrij University in Amsterdam. But I'm going to be formerly at Leiden and the LSE, London School of Economics, and Leicester and Strathclyde in Glasgow as well. And I've got an international scholar at Milan at the university out there. And as I've mentioned already, the Riga Graduate School of Law at Yeditepe University, so a very European approach to law and digital technologies. Now, when people ask me what I do, I often describe myself as a regulatory theorist. And what I mean by regulatory theorist is it sits complementary to something like governance. And so if you think as governance as being the primary umbrella and regulation or regulatory theory as being the sort of secondary umbrella, I kind of sit there. Governance, I think, is more broad than regulation. And as a European, I care a lot about fundamental rights and constitutional rights or protections for people. And the reason why I bring this up is because my ethos is humans first, technology second. And I apply the regulatory theories that I think about the ways that we can make technology work for humans and how that technology should work for humans. What sort of things should we take into consideration when we think about the governance of emerging technologies or digital technologies and how we interact with them? And of course, that means that we have to sit and think about the impact on different areas of society and, adopt some sort of buzzwords like ecosystem or information ecosystem or the digital ecosystem in which we live in. So as a regulatory theorist, I get to sit above the law and I think about how the law impacts us because sometimes the law might be, well thought out, but we haven't thought about the unintended consequences of that law. Or we haven't thought about the impact that it has on a group of people that might not have been thought about in the development of the technology itself. So, for example, a child. We might think about the impact of the law and technology on disparate groups that we might not have thought of when we developed this hot new technology like AI to interact with. And sometimes the law can develop or is actually responsible for problems. So you can have a great First Amendment, or you can have an Article 10 right to free speech, or a charter right under Article 11 to free information and to free expression. But then you get disinformation as a result of that, that is sometimes considered a protected form of speech. So the law actually creates a problem. And then dark patterns is the thing that I've been working on over the last few years, where the law creates obligations on platforms and digital technologies. And as a result of meeting these obligations, companies and technologists promote shortcuts to complying, which are nefarious or dark and deceitful in their application. And we call these dark patterns, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. And this is going to manifest in a couple of books, one on disinformation and one on dark patterns. So I know we talk about internet governance, and I'm sure you've talked about this in a number of different classes. A number of different classes. But what I want to do is make sure that we're all on the same wavelength and put some definitions to you. So historically, when I've talked about internet governance, I've leaned on the World Summit on the Information Society definition of internet governance. So this is my definition, which is kind of borrowing some aspects of the WSIS. The dynamic and participatory process of shaping, regulating, and harmonizing the technical, legal, economic, and social frameworks that define the operation, use, and evolution of the internet and digital technologies, balancing competing interests to foster accessibility, security, innovation, and respect for fundamental rights in a globally interconnected digital ecosystem. And so that's a bit of a mouthful, I think. And more recently, I've been using this. So internet governance is the orchestration of technological, legal, and social systems that ensure the equitable and sustainable evolution of the internet. It addresses power asymmetries, fosters innovation, and safeguards the rights and dignity of all users in a globally interconnected digital commons. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about internet governance. And so that's the framing of it we should keep in the back of our minds. Now, what do I mean when I talk about regulation? Because you might find this a bit of a surprise. Europeans and Americans view regulation very, very differently. And I think it's important to sort of get those out of the way early on so we all know that we're talking in the same language. So the person on the top of the screen there is a Harvard law professor called Larry Lessig. Now, if you were in and around internet theory in around the 2010s, or even more broadly in regulatory discussions anywhere, you would have come across this person's book, which was called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And the emphasis is Other Laws of Cyberspace is by me, but if you look at the book is called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And what Lessig is really doing here is he's laying out this kind of cyber paternalistic idea of regulation. And that the regulability for him is about the capacity of government to regulate behavior within its proper reach. So the government is the one responsible for passing the laws. The government has obligations of transparency about making those laws accessible. The government can be challenged by groups of people who don't like the laws. And if in an extreme example or less extreme, you can go protest your government and demand a change. And in a more extreme, you can overthrow your government, hopefully through an election rather than an insurrection. But what Les really brought to the table was this idea that government should be the people who are writing the laws, but the internet's very different. And the internet is largely determined by private corporations or even public corporations who are using the code to control us. So if Apple or Microsoft or Cisco wants us to do certain things, they can write code in a way that brings about an outcome that benefits them. So Time Warner can direct us to music that they have a stake in. They can promote certain content via an algorithm that they have a stake in. YouTube can promote content which is they have a financial or an economic interest in promoting. So this is the argument of the cyber paternalists in the code, whether it's embedded in a digital technology or whether it's in an algorithm or whether it's in a recommender system today, is the thing that controls us. And Lessig's big concern back in 2010 was that these big corporations were effectively more powerful than nation states because they were more controlling of us than the states, but they lacked the transparency, they lacked accountability, they lacked the ability to dialogue. You couldn't overthrow Apple if you didn't like when they changed their terms and conditions or updated their privacy policy. Now, the person on the bottom of the screen is a law professor called Andrew Murray, who works at the London School of Economics. And he is more Eurocentric. He's Scottish, like me, actually lives a few miles down the road from where I grew up, or where I stay in Scotland. And his definition is all forms of social control state and non-state, intended and unintended. So the big word that's missing from his definition is government. He doesn't care as much about government's ability to control you, rather the fact that you are controlled, that the regulation is being used in a sense that's very different from the type that you might expect to hear on Fox News if you were an American, or by Trump, where you want to remove all the regulations. In Europe, regulation is not a bad word. In fact, it's a word that you hear we need more of. We need more laws all the time to bring about this healthy information ecosystem. So we need to govern through laws and create new forms of laws to deal with the problems and the challenges that arise from digital technologies. And so the European approach and the American approach are very contrasting. They're not the same, even though they were aligned with capitalist ideals and neoliberalism. We are not the same in the sense of this antithesis of regulation, or the anti-regulation mindset that often permeates American discussions about how to govern or regulate new forms of technology. So I want to take a little side trip now that we've got those definitions out the way, and I want to take you to a group by Gartner. Sorry, a group called Gartner. And every once in a while, they put out a list of, they call these are kind of called the hype cycles, where they might say, oh, the AI hype cycle, or as this one is, the emergent technology hype cycle. And what they do is you can go back historically and look and see where these hype cycles exist and how they're going to, usually you go up and then you come down, and then you have a period of the trough of disillusionment. And then you get all the people that are living outside of the realm of possibilities or craziness when it comes to emergent technologies. And then you start seeing people actually being able, that hype leveling off, and then the real people that want to make something or do something essential with it, that maybe try and find a way to become productive. And so, here you can see things like autonomous agents and reinforcement learning and federated machine learning and homomorphic encryption are at the top of the emergent technologies hype cycle. But generative AI is actually on the way down. We're trying to get over it. And as you can see, we're moving towards large action models, where the hype cycle is starting. So what you should take away from this slide is that there's a lot of hype around emerging technologies, which you wouldn't necessarily group together or even categorize as the same. So I wouldn't see a large action model to be the same as a working robot, yet it is still a form of emergent technologies. So maybe what we ought to do is think about emergent technologies and how we should classify them, because how we classify them is um, uh, really important to understanding how we think about emergent technologies. Bill, yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, I was a little surprised not to see quantum computing um, anywhere along this, because at least in the environment I work in, it's which is cryptography and security. It's a rapidly growing concern, I guess is the way to phrase it.
Yeah, I would think that quantum computing is probably already in the slope of enlightenment. I think the hype or the expectations around quantum computing took off a couple of years ago, and we've already moved past that to the slope of enlightenment, where we're actually seeing people doing something meaningful with that product. That's how this slope tends to operate. So we've moved beyond the peak of inflated expectations towards the slope of enlightenment, maybe even the plateau of productivity, where people are trying to do stuff with it. But maybe that's my guess.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So let me give you a slide. This is a typology I came up with to think about various forms of emergent technologies and to give you some definitions and some examples and what characteristics of these look like. So foundational technologies are building blocks for other innovations. So AI and quantum computing fall under that umbrella or fall under that characteristics, and they have wide applicability. But they enable new things to be developed on top of the actual underlying emergent technology itself. Edge computing, advanced robots, and 5G are amplifications of existing processes for efficiency that increase efficiency and scalability. So 5G is just a better form of 4G. Does that make sense? If that's maybe a simplify. It improves the existing system. Disruptive technologies are where there's new markets or make existing ones obsolete. So the metaverse, for example, or autonomous vehicles would be disruptive. And I think the characteristic of this technology is that they significantly alter markets or societal norms, often displacing existing players. So compare and contrast that to convergent technologies like Internet of Things or cyber physical systems, where these things merge. So like it's not enough to have a robot, you need to have a robot that merges with a physical body. And so that you then maybe allow somebody to walk again because you're giving data, you're training the machine how to walk relative to the disabilities or the disadvantages, the physical disadvantages that somebody that might be disabled carries with them at the moment that they put on the exoskeleton. Contextual technologies, smart cities, climate tech, agri-tech, these address localized or niche problems often tied to sustainability or societal goals. Speculative technologies, nuclear fission, neural interfaces, space colonization. I can think of one high-profile person that spends an awful lot of time in the field of speculative technologies. His name rhymes with Elon. High risk, high reward, often relying on future breakthroughs. And then ethical and governance technologies, think about using a technology to solve some of the problems that another technology creates. So if I'm using an algorithm, for example, create a technology to study how the algorithm treats data or how a machine learns or to model what the black box looks like. And existential technologies are the ones that are so that these have profound implications for humanity's trajectory. And in that, I'm grouping artificial general intelligence, geoengineering, and synthetic biology. So a lot of advanced things to think about there. So if we go back to the slide, I mean, that is a broad picture of various forms of emergent technologies. And so how do you govern them all? I mean, how do you regulate them all? I mean, to me, it would be a bit of a nightmare to have one specific set of laws for agri-tech and another specific set of laws for smart cities and a completely different set of laws for synthetic biology. Because even though they're characterized like this, there's clearly a link between synthetic biology and agri-tech. Because if you're creating drought-resistant crops through synthetic kernel creation, or maybe even 3D printing AI DNA, we're maybe making that up a little bit, but you get the point. How do you have a set of laws or norms that govern all these different forms of technology? And that's what I spent a lot of my time thinking about. And so these are the things that I think the approaches that we have. The first is innovate first and remedy later. Now, we have 20 years of the Americans doing this. You know, we have 20 years of let's build the internet and see what happens. Let's build Facebook and see what happens. Let's connect people. Let's give people platforms to microblog and they can interact with everybody. That's great. But then we haven't thought about the harms that might come along with that, like hate speech, like racial discrimination, like disadvantage, like minimizing the voices of marginalized communities, not giving people the space to compete on the marketplace of ideas. This approach surely encourages rapid innovation and growth, but it only recognizes that harms exist when they manifest. So you don't really care about the harms that might occur. You're all about the innovation and getting it out there, and you might realize that there are harms way too late. So if you have people that become anorexic because they are watching eating disorder content on TikTok because TikTok is promoting this content via their algorithm, that's causing a significant amount of harms. But what's important to TikTok is let's get our product out there so we can start, building up mass appeal by people and then change the way that we deliver content into people's homes. A second way of governance is reactive governance, where you address the harms as they arise. Okay? You are free to innovate TikTok. You can put any content that you want out there. Now that we know that some of the teenagers that view your content tend to fall into the habit of searching for eating disorder material, let's change the algorithm to remove that as a potential content that teenagers can view. So you're reacting to the problem. Now, the third category I'm going to call proactive governance. Now, proactive governance is taking precaution and being aware that there's risk and taking the measures to prevent harm before they occur. And what that means is you have to slow down. You don't innovate first. You think about the risks first, and then you innovate before widespread deployment of your product or your digital technology or your goods and service. And the fourth form, which is a little bit different from the first threes, is to think about tech-neutral regulation. Develop laws and policies that focus on outcomes and not specific technologies. A good example of this, we don't define a computer, right? It's impossible to define a computer anymore because a computer, 10 years ago would be a PC sitting on a desk. Nowadays, it's an iPad, or it's a Kindle, or it's a laptop, or it's your home security service, or if you drive a Tesla, it's a computer on wheels. If you are thinking about one way of thinking about tech neutral regulation is to remove the technology altogether and focus on what the computer is actually doing. It's processing data. It's taking an algorithm, and the algorithm is thinking about what to do or what to prevent. So then you don't necessarily have to regulate the website or the platform. You regulate the activity that is taking place on the device. And then you will never get caught out by having different forms of technology. So tech neutral regulation ensures that people are complying with principles and then applying those principles to whatever the technology is. So whether it's synthetic biology or agri-tech or quantum computing, it doesn't matter what the technology is. You just ensure that what you do is fair, that it's transparent, and that there's an accountability process for the people using that technology. And the risk of this is that you might have to constantly think about updating to address unforeseen use cases. So a good example will be, think about messaging apps, right? Many of you will be using WhatsApp. Many of you will be using Facebook Messenger. Some of you might be using Signal. Another popular one is Telegram or Telegraph or Telegram. Is it Telegram, isn't it? Yeah. And Telegram is a good example of an app that doesn't fit neatly under our definition of private messaging services because Telegram is not private. It's something that sits there. Anybody can be added to a group. You have these big, massive private groups that form on Telegram. And that doesn't neatly fall under the European definitions of private messaging services. So that's a good example of when that might not work. So work well. So these are the approaches to governing emergent technologies. Let's focus on which you like or which approach is best. Innovate first, remedy later is generally thought about with Americans and kind of pushing technology out there. I would also say that reactive governance is also what happens in America. So we'll innovate and then we're going to react in relation to the harm. So usually you see somebody sues as a result of a harm being associated with an innovative technology. In Europe, we spend a lot of time talking about the precautionary principle. In fact, the precautionary principle is embedded in EU law under the Charter of Fundamental Rights under which we operate under. And so our emphasis is about taking precaution to prevent harm in the face of scientific uncertainty. And tech neutral regulation is something that we're seeing kind of globally, including Africa, including Europe, and including the US and China as well. Now, let's think about these competing models of governance then, right? So each model of governance that I just discussed is largely related to the political ideologies, the economic goals, and the cultural values that adopt that model of governance or integrate that model of governance. So the US, innovate first, remedy later, it's dynamic. It encourages sort of innovation, particularly in AI, to maintain that global leadership. And the risk to the US, the risk that model has, or the governance model has, is that there's potential societal harms due to delayed regulation. Now, this is clearly rooted in this notion of laissez-faire capitalism, that this, put your stuff out there, we'll promote you because it's always important to be first. Because if you're first, then you're going to be able to compete on the marketplace and you'll be able to take a position, you're going to be able to stake a power claim, and the US will get a benefit through tax dollars and additional economic growth that comes about as a result of your economy or your economic growth. In China, it's more reactive with strategic planning. So the state drives the innovation rather than the market driving the innovation. And it's to dominate strategically important sectors like telecoms or like internet service providers, like internet security or security protocols for cybersecurity purposes to ensure strict controls necessary in the eyes of the state to ensure security and stability. And the third, or the risk in here is that there is a surveillance concerns and there's a lack of transparency about how all of this works. And finally, the EU. In the EU, the approach is proactive and taking precaution in the face of uncertainty or the risk of harm, or uncertainty about the risk of harm and the degree of severity as a result of a harm taking place. So as I've said to you already, like the US, which has its amendments to the Constitution, the constitutional document in the EU is the Charter on Fundamental Rights. That document ensures that European citizens or EU citizens are protected in the sense of they have a right to privacy, they have a right to data protection, they have a right to free information, they have a right to security, they have a right to liberty, they have a right to employment law. There are all these protections that are built into the Charter, and the precautionary principle focuses or encourages lawmakers to go slowly, to protect fundamental rights, and protect the standards associated through preemptive regulation. Now, the critics will say that this stifles innovation and competitiveness, and we've just had a major report in Europe that has come out to say that Europe's approach to governing emerging technologies actually is stifling to innovation. We don't have any large European companies which are equivalent of Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or Microsoft. And we basically make copycat technologies based upon the innovators that come out of Europe. Alfredo, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. You bring to my mind a lot of interesting questions, but the main one has to deal with, and I'm guessing you're aware of the multi-stakeholder model discussion that is happening in different organizations, especially the United Nations, where they're trying to redefine how the multi-stakeholder model is working and how to innovate or improve on it. Now, when you're talking about these different models of governance, it's interesting. How can we uh, consolidate all these approaches into something that we could call a universal framework in order to avoid geopolitical issues that are happening right now because of these different approaches? Do you have any ideas, or are you going to mention something about
Well,
that?
yeah, I don't think I have time to. I don't think I have time to mention this in the slides directly, but I'll take some time to answer the question because I think it's a really important question. For me, the precautionary approach is correctly with its critics. It does stifle innovation. I don't say that loosely. I do believe it stifles innovation. But there's also ample evidence that an inclusion multi-stakeholder approach to governance will lower the crests and the troughs that often comes with unfettered innovation. So inclusion in governance models throughout the life cycle, and I don't just mean from the point of start of innovation, I mean till the end of a product's life cycle, I think are really important means of getting people to do things. Now, I don't know that for me, I'm not sure that the UN is the right body to oversee market-based innovation, but creating the norms and standards, for example, human rights impact assessment on the effects of you could definitely rely on the UN, and that requires multi-stakeholder governance in order to do that. And I do think that the EU, as part of the precautionary approach, encourages or even mandates those type of impact assessments to be taken into consideration. Does it slow it down? Yes. Is slowing down a good thing? Sometimes, but I've got one small thing that I want to put in everybody's head to understand these tensions, and that's this quote. This is Eric Schmidt, who is the former Google boss, the head of Google, and he slammed the transparency rules that the EU was putting up in its AI bill before it became an act. And this quote was lifted from a speech that he gave. But we must win the AI competition that is intensifying strategic competition with China. China's plans, resources, and progress should concern all Americans. It is an AI peer in many areas and an AI leader in some applications. We take China's ambition to surpass the United States as the world's AI leader within a decade. So, why I wanted to point brought this quote out to you was to talk about the political tensions which are driving these regulatory tensions. Now, if 90% of members slow down and adopt a multi-stakeholder approach, while China is pushing its reactive approach with strategic planning, you're going to have some technologies which fall that will fall by the wayside or slow down in the face of the geopolitical tensions that are taking place across the globe. And I think that's one of the problems that we haven't sorted out relative to these forms of technology. Give me one other, here we go, for example. So let's look at what we've got here. So in the world, we have some liberal democracies, some authoritarian states, and some social democracies. Now, the private sector innovation that comes in a liberal democracy requires minimal state intervention, and the regulations often go by the wayside so that you can put the emphasis on market-led solutions. Now, this is why you get the Fox Newses of the world's, the Republican candidates generally screaming how regulation's horrible for every one regulation that's passed, we're going to get rid of 5. It is a mindset, is a political ideology that drives various governance approaches. And if the political leaders are of the belief that the US is in competition with China, then that we need unfettered regulation because we have to dominate and win the race. And the EU is saying, okay, let's take a completely different approach and develop precaution and collective rights through extensive regulations. Then it is pretty clear to me that some of the AI policy that is coming out from Europe is seen by Europeans as being the common sense, sensible approach, but it's also directly responsible for why we don't have a chat GPT, a European chat GPT, or a European Facebook, or a European Dropbox. We've only developed them in responses to the technology being made available. So the way I've always looked at governance is that governance models are political systems in action, and they shape technology in their image. Now, what this means for Europe is unknown. For me, what it means for Africa is unknown. Because the one thing we do know about Donald Trump, because he said it, is that he wants to fire up technology. He wants to get out of the way. His promoters were the crypto bros, the Silicon Valley people that were promoting a laissez-faire approach of regulations of these technologies, and that they want to get out of the way to ensure that the US can compete or remain a leader in the global marketplace. And so I can't say that any one of these things is right or wrong. That's not my place. But what I can say is that these governance models tend to reflect the political ideologies of the people making policy in these systems. And that's an important point to understand. Now, this is where I think the trade-off between speed ethics and competitiveness works. I don't think the EU is globally competitive at the moment. And I think the US and China are a little bit closer together than people might, or a little further apart than people might like. But the investment in cutting edge research and commercialization for economic and military dominance, and the national rhetoric and strategic competition shape governance. And the EU's position is more about trustworthiness and ethics. And you don't have to look very far to see the EU as being the EU's AI Act really struggles, or is at least a law that tries to balance competitiveness while adhering to the precautionary principle that allows or mandates that lawmakers and policymakers must make laws in the face of scientific uncertainty about the risk of harm. Now, what does that mean? Well, these different approaches create challenges for international cooperation. So the GDPR, which you may have heard of as a European data protection rules, are extraterritorial in the sense of if you want to promote your technology into the EU market and that technology processes personal data, you must comply with the GDPR. Compare and contrast this to the US, which doesn't have a federal data protection law. Rather, it has sector specific. So you get very strong protections for the processing of tax-related data. And you have very strong protections for health-related data in America. But you don't have a general prohibition on the processing of personal data like you do under the General Data Protection Regulation. And this idea creates a specific challenge for governance norms because you get technology bifurcation, and at the same time, you have different regulatory frameworks. So, if the EU writes a GDPR type law, and the US gets its act together and writes a US data protection law, and you're an American company working in Europe or a European company working in or trying to access the American market, what rules do you have to face, or what standards should you follow? And then you have two competing laws that might have the effect on companies moving from one jurisdiction to another. This idea of regulatory arbitrage, that you will move wherever the laws are most suitable for you. And what this also means is that there's global opportunities for people working in internet governance. The first is coming up with standardizing principles. And then you also are able to leverage your soft power. So the EU doesn't really have to worry about what the US does, because the EU is such a big market that if it creates a set of rules and the US wants to play ball, then they're going to adapt their laws in order to have access to the EU market. Vice versa, if the African market wants to access the EU, and process personal data of Europeans, then it's going to have to adapt and comply with the EU. And so the effect is that the laws of the European Union set the governance standards across the world. And so you get various forms of influence through what's called the Brussels effect. Now, how do we go then? I've only got a few minutes left and I'll open up some questions. How do we go from global governance to risk? Now, we know that, or risk frameworks. So we know that global governance challenges the interplay between innovation, precaution, and uncertainty. And so addressing these dynamics requires nuanced approaches to risk and harm. Governance models must therefore safeguard fundamental rights while allowing for technological process. And the precautionary principle ensures that harm is mitigated even in the face of uncertainty. And then we go from global governance challenges to practical frameworks to explore how regulatory systems classify and address risks in emergent technologies. And so how should a governance framework ensure ethical and inclusive innovation while preemptively mitigating harm? And the way that we've done this, or the way that we're doing this at present, is by regulating risk. Governance has moved from governance standards to the regulation of risk. Now, I'm going to flash forward one slide very quickly because I think this is a bit more visual for you. But this is the pyramid of risk that you can find in the EU AI Act. And so some risk is prohibited. It's unacceptable. We don't want any part of AI that does unacceptable risk. So we're gonna put a ban on it. We're gonna put a blanket ban on it altogether. At the bottom end of the spectrum, you have minimal or no risk. So you have permitted with no restriction. So you don't need to do anything. We might create a code of conduct, which is voluntary, so that people can follow along or look at the best practices. But the EU has determined that some AI has zero risk. And then in the middle, you have, I don't want to call it medium risk because that's not accurate. You have high risk and you have AI with specific obligations. And so governance has gone from governance standards to the regulation of risk. And this is one example of how we've thought about regulating these forms of emerging technologies. Now, to give you a little bit more, we could characterize these things that we view as manipulative, exploitative, social control practices that contradict fundamental rights and union values, and we should just ban them altogether. And then you have high risk practices. While they don't contradict fundamental rights, they run the significant risks of adversely impacting fundamental rights. And so exhibiting such a level of risk must implement many compliance requirements before being permitted on the market. And then you can have a list of high-risk cases, which the European Commission is empowered under the Act to amend without necessarily revising the entire Act. So remember, the risk of technologically neutral regulation is that you might have to update it as new permitted and prohibited use cases become aware. That's how the law is mandating technologically neutral And finally, an AI system that does not pose high risks or qualify as a prohibited practice is called a low risk system. And that just has basic compliance obligations. So I'm going to conclude here on this slide. I think we're about out of time, aren't we, Glenn? Is that about right?
That's right.
So governance of emergent technologies must balance rapid innovation. I think it's fair to say that we've been through a hype cycle when it comes to the internet and digital technologies. And now we're moving to an AI and sort of an advanced computing hype cycle. It's a very exciting time to be alive, I think. But there's as we're going from the digital revolution to the AI revolution. But we need to find a way of striking the balance without compromising our fundamental rights. The US, the EU, China embody diverse approaches. And of course, at the heart of all of this is Africa and its contribution, which is often overlooked. And I know I'm conscious of the fact that I've not mentioned much of Africa, but the impact that many of these new emerging technologies will have on Africans we need to have a far more inclusive approach when we think about the diverse governance of emerging technologies, especially when you think about the vast amount of soft or hard raw materials that are needed to make the stuff all work and to power all of these emerging technologies. And the way forward, I've given you three simple, very generic ways to think about it, is we need to figure out a way to prioritize adaptive frameworks that evolve with technological advancements. We need to figure out a way to commit. I think this is the relative to Alfredo's question. How do we figure out global collaboration to standardize those principles and to promote equitable development? And at the same time, and I think the key to all of this is to empower civil society, businesses, and policymakers to co-create solutions. Now, I use the phrase co-create solutions. We could also use multi-stakeholder forms of governance as a synonym there. So I will leave you with this. How do we create governance systems that are inclusive, future-proof, and resilient against the uncertainties of emerging technologies? And the answer that we are at now is by regulating the risks associated with those emerging technologies. Thank you very much. Glenn, over to you.
Great, thank you. That is so thick in terms of content. I'll have to watch the video a couple of times to absorb it all. Really great, quite good. My first question or observation is that governments, when they bring in regulations, that's usually sort of after the cattle or horses out of the barn. So it's sort of not proactive, it's reactive. And so how do you deal with that? Because, you don't want to slow innovation by having draconian laws. But on the other hand, by the time they get their act together and whether in parliament or whatever way they come up with the regulation, it seems to be inadequate. So it's inbuilt in the system. So how do you deal with that? Because they're adverse to risk.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's one that I think we're probably at the transition point. We've gone from being reactive, and we're trying to figure out a way to become proactive. And I think the mistakes that we've made, or maybe let me rephrase that, is that we recognize that digital technology, and in particular social media companies, and the mass sharing of personal data have had massive effects on people. And the government have responded to that by saying we need to come up with some new laws, whether it's cyberbullying or online safety or whatever. And the thing that has caught traction here is the obligation of a duty of care, right? Which is lawyers' phrase for you have an obligation to protect the people who are using your services. It doesn't matter what harms are associated with those services. You have an obligation as a provider or a platform to look after the people who are using your services. You have a duty of care. And that means that you don't have to be, in theory, it means that you don't have to be reactive. It changes the legal obligation for you to think about the potential of harm before it happens. So if you know your emerging technology is going to be used for the promotion of hate speech, for example, then, okay, before you deploy it, you need to come up with a way to rethink your algorithms and how that algorithm might promote really negative content to people who might not or shouldn't be necessarily exposed to it. Or if you are going to be selling particular products, do you want that content to be promoted via profiling and digital technologies that involve massive amounts of data processing to take advantage of the fact that some of them might be vulnerable at the very moment that you deliver the advertisement or the promotion to that person? Well, if that's the case, then maybe we should have a system that gets you to think about that before you deploy the technology. So I think we're at this moment, maybe the last couple of years, and maybe the next couple of years, the Digital Services Act, the Online Safety Act in the UK, the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia. Many of the BRIC countries have come up with sort of proactive duties that platforms have to take. You know, you want to call it an impact assessment or some sort of compliance obligations. But the idea is to get these companies that are so big, that are deploying these products and these platforms to think about the impact before they actually go into to go into practice. And I just feel like now is the time we can probably reflect on, and maybe 10 years from now, we'll look at this period of time as the transition from reactive to proactive. And at least that's what the lawmakers are trying to do.
Great, thank you. I saw Alfredo's hand up, and I noticed that both Alfredo and Bill gave comments. Who wants to jump in? We have a few more minutes. Alfredo, did you want to elaborate, or Bill?
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just trying to make the point that we can try to figure out what, what harms a new technology might have, but imagination may fail us. I mean, the people who were creating the ARPANET back in the late 60s and 70s never imagined general use email, let alone something like YouTube or with cat videos or Amazon selling
Sure.
stuff all over the world. So
Yeah.
there's uncertainty in there, no matter how much we try to imagine what.
I don't want to give anybody the impression that the EU, as a means of regulating this stuff, has created a system of one-time and one-time only impact assessments. AI in particular is ongoing. You have to take into consideration the impacts that you may have, and then as new risks and harms come to light, be responsive and reactive. But therefore, like Glenn just said, it's a moving target. That's one way of looking at it. But it's also, it has to be adaptive and responsive regulation in the European Union sense, is that, oh, we didn't anticipate this because we didn't know to consider it, but we know it's there. So this is how we're going to resolve that issue now. And so the most obvious example would be recommender systems. If a recommender system is promoting content that you like, or is designed to promote content that you might have an interest in, that's great. But what if you do if it's promoting really harmful content because people are really interested in harmful content? Then, well, oh, we didn't even think about that. Okay, well, now we realize that's a problem. So let's have a category of types of content that become particularly or impossible, or ranging from difficult to severe to impossible for people to be able to access. Well, we will adapt our recommender system in response to new and emerging knowledge about the types of problems that those recommender systems are causing.
I'm going to give Alfredo, because I know he had a comment. Your final question or comment, Alfredo?
Yeah, I just want to make aware the audience, the participants we have, that since Africa is moving forward in developing all these new technology environments and scenarios in each one of their countries, this is a great opportunity to think about these, anticipating some risk you might confront, so that you incorporate all these other organizations and countries that are developing policies to consider for the unintended events that you think might happen once you integrate all these new technologies that you're planning on developing. I do have a question for you, Mark. Do you foresee any organization that worldwide might develop a framework that different countries could follow using emergent technologies?
Well, I think that the model art, so yeah, so look, one of the things that I was involved in a couple of years ago was the development of the model articles for platform regulation that was put together by UNESCO. And they had a very big multi-stakeholder approach. They took a lot of impact and insights from various different civil society groups. And the reason why they did that was not every country wants to follow the European Union approach to platform regulation, and not everybody is prepared or willing to approach the Americans, and they don't want to be tied down to the Russian or the Chinese approach. And so what UNESCO did was they said, okay, well, let's come up with a draft model articles, which is very, which is, if you're a small emerging economy or a developing economy, or you're an African economy and you have a platform or you want to promote a platform, many of these organizations, these entities, whether it's civil society, they come to us and say, hey, we don't really want to do the American thing, and we don't have the manpower to enforce the European approach, but we'd really like some guidance on how we can, the platforms that are emerging in our economy can follow them. And so the UNESCO model articles on platform regulation is a good example of a sort of a new way of creating kind of general principles that can be adapted towards various types of economies and cultures. And that's probably the easiest example I can come up with off the top of my head.
Great. Thank you, everybody. It's been really quite illuminating. Thank you again. And I found you through the NCUC list because we want to encourage the, PhD students and professors through the ICANN community to share their research. But this has been a fantastic session, and I appreciate your time and energy to put into the presentation and share with us.
Can I follow up on one point, Glenn,
Sure.
if I may?
Go right ahead.
When I started off, my PhD supervisor was a guy called Konstantinos Kometas, who you may know or may heard of.
Oh, I know Constantine well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think I was his first PhD student. Then he left to go work at the Internet Society.
Yeah.
So I joined the ICANN NCUC group as I think it was an actual law student at the time. And look at me now. I'm working for the European Commission. This is a starting point to go on to bigger and better things. And over the years, the emails are plenty, but you do get a sense of the big issues, and it keeps you, going. And it's a great community of people that really have a great interest. So I would encourage all the PhD students, all the people that are watching this recording to join these organizations, to sign up for these newsletters, to be involved with these communities, because it is a mindset and a societal norm which everybody gets the benefit from. And I'm living proof of that myself.
There you go. There you go. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Don't forget to fill out the session survey. If you are looking at getting the certificate from our program, please make sure you finish all the quizzes and the final evaluation form. Okay, again, that concludes the call today. This is our final session for Group K. Looking forward to the next group. Thanks again. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.